There is a reason people loosely describe most of Russia as empty. This is the largest country on Earth, a state stretched across Eastern Europe and Northern Asia, across 11 time zones, with environments ranging from steppe to deep forest to Arctic tundra. And yet, the first thing that matters is not its scale, but its imbalance. Population and infrastructure do not spread evenly across that enormous body. They compress toward the west and the south, while the continental interior remains thinly settled, harshly exposed, and structurally difficult to hold. So the question is not simply what lies in that vast interior. The better question is why so much of it still resists ordinary permanence, why repeated attempts to fill the space have so often narrowed back into corridors, enclaves, and retreat. The first clue is that the empty interior is not untouched. It is marked by ambition. Remote settlement in Russia's far northern and eastern regions was repeatedly pushed by state planning, industrial policy, and strategic need, even when those places sat far from major markets and ordinary economic logic. Academic work on post-Soviet population decline in the extreme north describes how some peripheral settlements weakened or closed altogether once the larger system that sustained them broke apart. That matters because it changes the meaning of emptiness. The interior is not empty in the sense of never attempted. It is empty in the sense of repeatedly tested and only conditionally held. The remnants of remote towns, work camps, extraction settlements, and transport outposts are not just historical debris. They are evidence that attempt number one already happened, and that it collided with costs and environmental pressures stronger than the original promise. Follow the main transit spine across the interior and the pattern becomes even clearer. Settlement does exist, but it clings to routes. Britannica's overview of Siberia notes that population remains sparse and is concentrated chiefly in the west and south. A long rail corridor still forms the backbone of movement across the continent, and that alone tells you something important. Life here advances in lines, not in blankets. Towns gather at stations, crossings, depots, and industrial nodes, but the distances between them remain immense. Beyond those lines, contact thins out fast. The monotony of the landscape is not just visual, it is logistical. Every kilometer multiplies the cost of fuel, repair, staffing, and resupply. Defensive infrastructure appears where continuity cannot be assumed, and survival becomes adaptive rather than expansive. The corridor is not proof that the interior was conquered. It is proof that movement had to be forced into narrow bands, because the surrounding scale keeps pushing back. Then you reach the major barrier, and it becomes obvious that the struggle is not only against distance, it is against the ground itself. Across huge parts of Russia, permanently frozen ground and permafrost-shaped soils impose engineering conditions that change the rules of settlement. Britannica notes that more than half of Russia is affected by permafrost, and the consequences are not abstract. Thawing ice-rich ground causes subsidence. Frost action distorts surfaces. Drainage worsens. Foundations weaken. Roads, rail beds, airfields, bridges, pipes, and communication lines all become maintenance problems before they become successes. A chapter on Russian Arctic settlements describes structural deformation in buildings and danger to transportation routes as climatic conditions change and thaw-related processes intensify. That is the moment when the interior stops looking like passive geography and starts behaving like a defensive actor. Human plants can cross it and sometimes exploit it, but only by entering a prolonged contest with a substrate that punishes disturbance and charges rent forever. That is also why the interior accumulates folklore so easily. In places where roads disappear into waterlogged flats, where maps show connection but travel still depends on season, and where a settlement can sit hundreds of kilometers from the next viable center, absence begins to feel uncanny. The terrain encourages stories of vanishing routes, of places that seem close on paper and unreachable in practice, of silence so complete it starts to sound deliberate. But the deeper answer is material, not mythical. One of the world's largest continuous flatlands in central Russia contains enormous, poorly drained areas and wide swampland, while major river systems run northward toward the Arctic Ocean. The result is a landscape that often redirects movement the wrong way, slows overland connection, and turns apparent openness into friction. The unease is real, but it does not come from mystery alone. It comes from geography that looks empty from above and becomes stubbornly difficult the moment anyone tries to live across it at scale. Then comes the paradox that keeps drawing people back. The interior contains extraordinary wealth. Britannica's educational summary of Siberia calls its abundance of natural resources the region's greatest asset, while noting that many of those resources lie in harsh lands, far from population centers. That is the central contradiction of so-called empty Russia. The land can be rich and still remain a bad place for mass permanence. Resource deposits can justify a mine, a pipeline, a field camp, a processing town, or a rail extension. They do not automatically justify broad civilian settlement. Academic work on Siberian regional costs points to huge spaces and underdeveloped infrastructure as major drivers of transport and energy burdens. The same environment that holds valuable deposits also inflates every ordinary requirement of life around them. Extraction may work, maintenance may work, a strategic corridor may work, but making all of that routine, affordable, and self-sustaining for millions of people is another question entirely. Wealth exists. So does the bill for touching it. For a while, there seems to be a hidden leverage point, almost a miracle loophole. Winter itself can become infrastructure. Frozen surfaces harden soft ground. Seasonal roads open, and the landscape briefly allows forms of access that summer denies. In a country where ordinary roads can be sparse and the terrain punishing, cold has often functioned not just as an enemy, but as a method. Yet that workaround contains its own failure inside it. The same research on permafrost region transport warns that warmer conditions are already degrading winter roads and reducing access to remote areas. A solution based on temperature is only as reliable as temperature. The interior appears manageable when frozen hard enough, then becomes unstable when the thaw returns or arrives earlier. What looked like a permanent answer turns out to be a seasonal permission slip. It lowers the barrier for a time, but it cannot remove the barrier itself. That is why so many northern systems feel improvised, even when they are massive. Their best trick is still fragile. Step back one level deeper, and the problem becomes even more fundamental. The obstacle is not only weather above ground, it is soil and ground condition below it. Russia does possess highly fertile dark grassland soils, the famous black earth type used extensively for cereals and livestock. But those soils belong to a particular belt of mid-latitude steppe and forest steppe, not to the whole northern and eastern interior. FAO's overview of Russian land notes that the country's soils are complex and, in many areas, not particularly suited to agriculture. Tens of millions of hectares are eroded, waterlogged, or swampy. Britannica's treatment of gelisols adds another layer. Permafrost-affected soils are fragile, easily eroded, and defined by persistent freezing close to the surface. So the deeper system's answer is brutal in its simplicity. Much of the interior is not just far away. It is built on a substrate that either does not want to grow food reliably, does not want to hold heavy structures cheaply, or does not want to do both at the same time. And then the geographic gatekeeper appears. The life-giving ingredients do exist within Russia, but they are unevenly distributed in ways that favor the margins over the core. The country's vast size and compact form create intense continental conditions because much of the land lies far from the moderating influence of the sea. At the same time, the more fertile black earth zones belong to the mid-latitude grassland belt rather than to the frozen or swamp-dominated north. Even water does not automatically rescue the interior. Large northern river systems cross enormous distances, but many drain toward the Arctic and cut through difficult lowlands, which is not the same thing as providing easy east-west integration or dense agricultural settlement. So warmth, fertile soils, and practical accessibility do not converge across most of the interior. They gather in narrower belts and edges. The core is left with repeated deficits: too cold, too wet in the wrong way, too far from markets, or too expensive to connect. Geography does not merely shape settlement here, it filters it. That would already be enough to keep the interior thinly settled. But the final blow is that the system does not stay still over time. The cold that once stabilized infrastructure can destabilize it when disturbed. The frozen ground that once carried a structure can lose strength as climatic conditions shift. Britannica notes that thawing permafrost is already increasing maintenance risks and costs on major rail infrastructure, and research on Russian Arctic settlements links warming to intensified structural deformation and transport danger. Planning in such a space is unstable by design because every long-term project must assume not one landscape, but a moving negotiation among cold, thaw, subsidence, drainage, cost, and distance. That is why the interior keeps producing the same outcome through different eras. Not because nobody noticed it, not because nobody invested, not because development simply has not arrived yet. The emptiness persists because it is systemic. Scale, climate, frozen ground, poor drainage, uneven soil, corridor dependence, and fragile logistics all point to the same final claim. What occupies most of empty Russia is not merely unused land, but a giant environment that repeatedly defeats the idea of ordinary human density.